How is everyone?
I'm doing good.
Awesome. Hello, Dr. Crook.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm happy to have the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me.
Hi, Peggy. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Mary. Hi, Dr. Fox.
Good evening.
How are you?
I'm doing good.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being able to join us tonight.
Oh, happy to be here.
For all the early people, so we're going to continue to let people kind of flow in, but it looks like we've got quite a few people in the room already, which is really exciting. So, hi, Dr. Lee.
There. Hi, how you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Well, I'm in Charlotte Airport right now.
You could have just come to my house. I'm only 30 minutes away.
My flight this morning was canceled, and I went back at 4 o'clock, so I'm here. Hopefully not staying the night.
Oh, dear.
At least I have a half hour free now.
Absolutely. Well, good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
Jay, I saw you pop in, I think. There you go.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing well. Thanks so much for being able to be part of the panel tonight.
No problem. I hope the technology works better on this one. I just got off a phone bank over the internet and everybody's technology was freezing out.
Oh, goodness. Oh,
Yeah, it was
goodness.
not good. Not good.
I'm just glad to have power. I lost power this morning for 4 hours because of all the sleet and the ice.
Wow.
30 minutes north of Charlotte. And so I sent Eric a message and says, hey, just in case I don't have power tonight, you might have to leave the panel, but hopefully it works, and it did. So.
Okay, well, let me see. I would show you all pictures of, well, this will give you an idea. This will give you an idea of what the back of my house looks like. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh,
We've
wow.
got 25 inches on the ground here, and it's about 8 degrees out right now. So
Wow.
it's cold.
Not jealous at all. Mm-mm. We're going to give people a few more seconds to jump on. It's the official start time, but we want to give people probably about another 30 seconds to hop in line. That way we can get started. I'll say this again, but I am recording the session. That way those who can't join us tonight will have a chance to pull it up some other time and be able to review it, because I think that this is going to be some great information shared tonight. I want to have it available for the students at any time. more seconds. All right, time is of the essence, so we want to respect everyone's here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming this evening. This evening's event, COVID-19, The Tale of One Pandemic, is part of the Black History Month Aflame and Unafraid series, which is sponsored by the Diversity and Inclusion Action Team. In the spirit of a liberal arts education, as well as trying to achieve cura personalis, the Unafraid and Aflame series includes the perspectives of history, English, art, social sciences, communication, student life, and with this event, the sciences. My name is Julie Goolsby, and I am currently a trustee for Spring Hill College, and I'm also the co-chair for the Diversity, Inclusion, and Action Team at Spring Hill College. So we're really excited to have this event tonight. It's kind of important to note that some news recently came out that showed that the CDC is now suggesting that our life expectancy has been diminished by 1 year due to COVID-19. And that number is even greater for the Black community. And so that's probably going to be part of what we'll talk about tonight. But tonight, we're really going to be discussing the pandemic from a virology perspective, as well as the impact it had on the nation. Then we're going to funnel that information down specifically to how this pandemic has specifically had a different rate with the Black community. Tonight, our speakers are going to be Dr. Debbie Fox from Spring Hill College, Dr. Jay Shannon, and Dr. Errol Crook. I'll be going through their biographies here in just one moment, but I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items. For the sake of transparency and being able to hear, we would ask that everyone mute your mics or your audio throughout the entire presentation. So please make sure that you are muted. If you have questions, we'll have a question and answer segment at the end. But if you have something burning that you want to get out of your brain, please feel free to use the chat function, and we'll be sure to go back through that to make sure we capture everyone's questions. So with that, I'll go through the biography, of Dr. Debbie Fox, since she will be the first person to present on today's panel. So she was born in Birmingham, Alabama, and she grew up in South Louisiana. So being in Mobile, Alabama is actually a perfect blend of these two locations. She was able to get her undergraduate degree in medical technology from LSU in Baton Rouge, her Master of Health Science from LSU School of Medicine, New Orleans, and her PhD in immunology from LSU School of Veterinary Medicine, Baton Rouge. She has worked in research at Tulane and Emory Medical Schools, and her research in the mid-90s involved the HIV vaccination using genetic material. This was a precursor to the research used to develop the new mRNA COVID vaccines. She has been teaching for a total of 25 years, 14 of which we have been blessed to have her at Spring Hill College. So with that, I would like Fox to lead us through her segment of tonight's panel.
Thank you, Julie. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here. I'm going to start off with kind of just some background information on the virus and a little tiny bit about the immune response. Hold on a second here. I'm going to share my screen there. So everybody can see that? It's good? Okay, great. Thanks. So here's just kind of an outline of what I want to talk about this evening. And I'm going to start with a little bit about where we think the virus that causes COVID-19 came from. And this is actually an image of coronavirus. And remember, these proteins sticking out here that kind of look like a fried chicken leg are the spike proteins that the vaccines are targeting in the immune response to. And we're going to talk about that more in a moment. So I'm going to go over a little bit about the origin of the virus, where it came from, some basic virology, get the terms right so we know what we're talking about, a little bit about the mutations and the variants that have been created by the mutations, and then a brief overview of the immune response. So let's start off with the origin of this virus that causes COVID-19. The virus name is SARS-CoV-2. That's severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. And it causes the disease that we're calling COVID-19. Where did it come from? Well, the short answer to that question is not sure. We don't know exactly where it came from. There are some hypotheses. What we do know, what is known about the virus, we know it came from animal to human. And an infection that is transmitted from animal to human is called a zoonosis. It is an emerging pathogen. It was completely new and novel to humans starting in late 2019. Genetically, the virus SARS-CoV-2 has similarities to the coronavirus that's found in bats and the coronavirus that's found in pangolins. So that has led to some hypotheses that that was the animal it was infecting. Maybe it went, one theory is it went from bats to pangolins to humans. Or maybe one human got infected at the same time with the one from bats and pangolins and they got mixed up. We don't really know yet. Over time, more information will be determined on this. Right now, it's just all theories. But supporting that this virus came from animal to human is we've seen coronaviruses do this in the past. SARS-CoV-1, so that's severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus number 1, was in 2003, caused a pandemic. It didn't hit the US, but many other countries were affected by it. It actually began late 2002 in mainland China in Guangzhou around October, November of 2002. And then early 2003 moved from Guangzhou to Hong Kong. And actually Guangzhou and Hong Kong are very close to each other. It's like a 70, 80-mile train ride. So it makes sense that it would get to Hong Kong easily. But then from Hong Kong, it went around the world. Not every country, but many countries were affected. This one, they think was in civet cats, or just called civets, and went from there to humans. And then in 2012, MERS, which is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, jumped from camels to humans, and it's still causing infections in the Middle East. So we know it's a zoonosis. We know it came from animal. We know it went from animal to human. Now, it may have initially gone animal to human, but not human to human. So there could have been some isolated cases that were not detected where it went from bat to human or pangolin to human, but not human to human. But at some point in late 2019, it acquired the ability to go human to human and jump-started our current pandemic. So why did this happen? Why are we seeing these viruses go from animal to human? Well, it's many factors all coming together at a perfect point in time and creating a perfect storm that is allowing these viruses to jump from animal to human. One big factor is climate change and changes in our environment. It's changing the ecology, it's changing the ecosystem, it's changing the way animals and humans interact, and that's a big factor. Human population and animal population demographics, where we are living, how many people are living there, urban sprawl, all this is contributing, again, to making human-animal interactions change and increasing the opportunity for viruses to go from animal to human. Destruction of forests, deforestation, that allows the animals to move out of that area because their home has been destroyed, and they may move into areas where there's more humans. Changes in farming, irrigation, building dams, using pesticides, all of this affects the ecology, affects the animals, and causes viruses. Like this is a civet, can go from the civet to human. This is one found in Asia. We don't have civets in North America. A comparable animal would be a skunk or a raccoon. They are in the similar family. And then the camel in 2012 in the Middle East, and then maybe bats and pangolins contributed to our current pandemic with COVID-19. And then at the same time, the viruses infecting these animals are evolving and changing and adapting and mutating. So changes within the pathogen could also be increasing our risk of these zoonosis or infections from animal to human. So all of these together create a perfect storm where the virus can move from the animal to the human. So I've been using the term virus, so let's define what a virus is. And virology, ology means study of, so virology is the study of viruses. Viruses are not cells, they're particles. Now this may look like the cell model you built in middle school, but it's not a cell, it's a particle. And all viruses have nucleic material, which is this kind of slinky looking thing here in the middle, that's coded in a protein. So all viruses have that. Some viruses have an additional layer called an envelope that has spike proteins on it. And coronavirus has that. So this would be a drawing or a model of what coronavirus looks like. Now this nucleic material contains the genetic code for that virus and allows it to make more virus particles. And in viruses, the genetic code can be DNA or RNA. And for coronavirus, it is RNA. Now this virus particle, when it's outside of a cell, when it's not infecting a host cell, it's inert. It can't do anything. It can't replicate, it can't fly, it can't swim, it can't crawl. It can do nothing. It's totally an inert particle. It's just there, sitting on a respiratory droplet waiting to be transmitted to a new human. And viruses have to get inside a host cell to replicate and survive. That's why it is so important right now that we wear masks with 3 layers, that we social distance and wash our hands, because if we keep the virus out of the cells, it's just an inert particle that can't do anything. So it's really important to keep the virus from getting in the human cell where it can replicate. So the virus has to enter a host cell. And once it's in there, it takes over that cell. It literally hijacks the cell's metabolism and ability to function. And now it's no longer inert because it's using the cell's machinery, the cell's own machinery, to now make new virus particles. So here's a coronavirus. The red is the RNA nucleic material. The green is the protein code. So all viruses have nucleic material and a protein code. Then some have an envelope, which is shown here in gray. And some, if they have an envelope, they have spike proteins, which is shown here in orange. That virus particle has to bind to receptors on the host cell. So this gray right here is the membrane of the host cell. It binds to a receptor. Then at that point, it releases its protein code with its genetic code into the cell. The protein code disintegrates, and the genetic code is now there ready to take over this cell, replicating the RNA, making copies of it, making new protein to make the protein code, making new spike proteins, and able to produce new virus particles that now can exit this cell and infect new cells or maybe even a new host. So it replicates, makes new virus particles. Those virus particles leave this cell. Now this cell that was infected and was hijacked by the virus never recovers completely. Even if the virus doesn't kill the cell directly, this cell will never regain its former function. So to stop the virus from spreading, we must stop this transmission. We must stop this part right here. Stop it from entering the cells. And we can do that by vaccinating and producing an immune response that can stop it, or by stopping the virus from ever getting in that person to start with masks, social distancing, and hand washing. If there's no host, the virus remains an inert particle that can do nothing. And if enough time passed, it's no longer viable and it cannot infect a new cell. So how does the virus that causes COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, how is it getting inside the cell? Well, like all viruses, it's binding to something on the surface of the cell that allows it to go in. And that something we call a receptor. And it's just simply a protein on the surface of the host cell. So it's binding to a receptor on the surface of the host cell. For SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, it attaches to an ACE2 receptor. Now, this protein on the surface of the cell, it has functions for the cell, which I'm not going to go into at this point, just accept that it's a protein on the surface of the cell, and it is what the virus uses. SARS-1 in 2003 used the same receptor as SARS-CoV-2, which is our current virus causing the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, this ACE2 receptor is found on a lot of different cells in humans. It's found in the human respiratory tract, including the upper respiratory system of the nose and the throat, and the lower respiratory, the lung, but also the intestine, the heart, the kidney, and the vessels, especially the arteries. That's why you're hearing about so many different types of symptoms that patients can have, because the virus can be getting into different types of cells in each patient. And some patients are having multiple organ system complications because the virus was able to enter cells in many different organs in the human body. Now, I know you're hearing lots in the news about the variants. Viruses have to duplicate their RNA. So here we have the coronavirus. It gets into the host cell. This is a host cell, the nucleus, and other organelles in the host cell. It gets in the host cell, releases its genetic code in the form of RNA, makes copies of that RNA. As it makes copies of the RNA, mistakes happen. And those mistakes are mutations. Okay, so it's copying the RNA. At the same time, it's also translating the RNA into new proteins to make new viruses. So it duplicates the RNA, makes more protein code, makes more spike proteins, and assembles hundreds of new virus particles that now exit the host cell and infect a new host cell, or leave that host and infect a new host. So the new virus particles are made, and the RNA was copied, and sometimes it copies just fine, but sometimes a mistake is made in making a copy. So like if we look here, here's the original sequence, and one single change, it's called a point mutation, could change what the virus is making in the copy. So a single mistake is a point mutation. Now, most of the time, these mutations are silent or neutral, meaning it made a change, but nothing changed in the virus. Okay, it looks the same, the protein looks the same. You can't see that this mutation happened. But over time, you can get an accumulation of these silent mutations, and that together with a mutation that gives the virus an advantage creates these new variants. Now, sometimes it works to the virus's disadvantage, and the mutation is deadly, and the particle does not survive. So it's a lottery. The virus is just replicating, and during that, there's a spontaneous random event called a mistake or mutation, and sometimes that has no effect, sometimes it's detrimental, and sometimes it's advantageous. So sometimes the virus wins the lottery and gets a mutation that gives it an advantage. So think about it. Less than 2 years ago, this virus was infecting animals only. As far as we know, it was infecting animals only. And then late 2019, it started infecting humans and spreading human to human. It had adapted and evolved to infect animals best. But over the last year, it's adapting and evolving to infect humans better. And that's not surprising. I mean, everyone expected this to happen, and it is happening. The scary part is now we're in a race between these new variants and getting everyone vaccinated, because if we can stop the virus, we can prevent it from buying lottery tickets. If we wear masks, social distance, wash our hands, get vaccinated, we're stopping the virus from getting a lottery ticket. It's not getting in a cell, it's not replicating. We're reducing these mutations happening. If the virus isn't replicating, the mutations can't happen. So by doing all of this, we stop the virus, slow it down, and we can slow down the production of these variants. What we don't want to happen, and hasn't happened yet, but what we don't want to happen is what's sometimes called an escape mutant, where it mutates to the point, so many changes that the immune response, whether from natural infection or from vaccination, no longer works. Now, just a little bit about the immune response. The immune response, these are our soldiers, our warriors that are fighting when we get an infection. And just like any battle, there's not just one plan of attack. So just like humans may battle air, land, sea, and then within that, there's specialized groups, our immune response does the same thing. And two mighty warriors, and I love these cartoons. These are by her website is Cell Cartoons Net. She does great immunology cartoons. But two players are the B cell and the T cell. And the B cell, once it sees the foreign invader, the virus, it produces a clone of itself, an identical B cells that are all capable of recognizing that invader. And it becomes a plasma cell. And it makes a protein called antibody that binds to that virus. Now, this cartoon says the flu, but we're going to pretend it's coronavirus. And the antibody, which actually is kind of physically shaped like a Y, binds to the virus, physically blocking it from binding to that ACE2 receptor. If it can't bind to that ACE2 receptor, it can't get inside the cell. If it cannot get inside the cell, it can't replicate. And this is called neutralizing the effect of the virus. So that's one branch of our army that is fighting invaders. And that's the B cells, which become plasma cells producing antibodies. The other branch is the T cells. And the T cells are capable of killing the cells that the virus got into. Now, remember earlier I said, once the virus infects a cell and hijacks it, that cell is never going to completely recover. So don't feel too bad that the T cell's now killing its own cell in its own body that was infected with the virus. That cell was already doomed. So now the T cell is going to kill any cells that the virus successfully infected. So the B cell is stopping the virus before it infects the cell. The T cell gets those that got past the antibody and infected a cell and kills the infected cell. Now, the reason they're saying, even if you've had COVID or even if you've been vaccinated, you still need to wear a mask, social distance, and wash hands, is because we don't know yet if the vaccine or natural infection produces enough of these antibodies to stop the virus before it infects cells. Maybe the reason people are protected is the T cell response is really strong and it's killing infected cells. So you don't get sick, the T cell is killing the cells that were infected. However, you might be able to spread it to others. So that's why even if you've had COVID-19 or been vaccinated, you need to keep wearing your mask, because it may be the T cell response that's providing protection from previous infection or from being vaccinated. If you want to know more about the immune response, I actually started a blog where I go into more detail about this process. Okay, that finishes my portion of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fox. I was taking a lot of notes. I feel like I'm back in school. So, but I'm more well-versed now, which is why we're here. So thank you so much. I'm going to save my questions for the end, though, because I've got quite a bit. Next, we're going to move to Dr. Shannon's segment of the presentation in the panel. And so I will go over his bio with you.
You could just say I'm from the class of 82. That's all they need to know.
He's from the class of 82. He is also a trustee for Spring Hill College and has a very esteemed background. One of the items which we noted is that he was the CEO of Cook County Health, and he is currently the principal at Health Management Associates. And so I'll leave it at that, Dr. Shannon, and I'll allow you to take over.
That's great. I'm the bridge, and thanks. I hope you all can see my slides. I'm going to be quick. We've all seen, I think, Michael Osterholm on the news a lot, and his comparison to this being a fire rather than waves, I think, is very apt. Much of what I'm going to share with you tonight is a case for understanding public health and epidemiology. And I'm not going to go into the details of each of these definitions, but I want to point out a few things. So here's the United States. These are the 10 or 12 countries that have been most affected across the world. And we are the leader. This is not a good thing in the number of confirmed cases. On the other hand, some people think, well, maybe that's just because we're a very populous nation. But in fact, if you look at confirmed cases, these are people who've had a positive test for the coronavirus, and you normalize it to the population. We are still far and away leading the world, indexed even to the population. Now, another way that people will look at things is they'll say, well, you know, it's just like a bad cold. You'll remember that last year there were some comparisons made early on. Is this as bad as the flu? Is this, you know, less bad than the flu? This is looking at case fatality ratios in various countries. And again, there are a lot of ways that you can inflate or deflate your case fatality ratios. This is something that the previous president said. We never talk about the fact that in the United States, fewer than 2% of the people with the condition die. And that's true. You can have a low proportion in the case fatality, either because you're doing a very good job or because you're testing a lot of people. In Mexico, you're more likely to get tested if you're deathly ill, and that can artifactually give you a high case fatality ratio. Again, a lot of devil in the details with these different measures of the condition. But there are other things that you can't escape. Now, a lot of people argue about how do you attribute a death to the coronavirus, but this is now no longer cases per 100,000, but rather this is deaths per 100,000 members of the population. And again, what you'll see here is that the United States is not doing well. The only countries that are doing a little bit worse than we are in deaths per 100,000 residents is Italy. And then this purple one is the UK, kind of lavender one. And that may have to do with the new variant that we're concerned about. So some people say, well, this is just a hoax. This whole thing is a hoax. Well, if you look at trends over time, what you're seeing, this is from the CDC, and this is expected deaths. And they know this from counting deaths in the population, and this is adjusted to the population. And they can count that over time. And there's seasonal variation in deaths, usually peaking, as you'll see, in January. And this is usually because in the cold winter months in North America, people have more cases of respiratory illnesses and pneumonias that lay them low. These trends that you see here, this yellow line, is what you would call the definition of excess deaths in a particular time period. And if you go beyond that limit, epidemiologists start to worry that there's a special cause for that. And look at the stupendous rise in that in our country over the past year. And this is clearly related to the pandemic. As you heard in Julie's introduction, we've seen a reduction in lifespan, if you can believe that. So I would argue that this is not a hoax. I'll show you a picture here. This is one of my former trainees, Dr. Matt Levino. He's been leading the COVID response at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. And Matt, like I, is a pulmonary and critical care physician. He's running this particular unit. It has more than 30 people on ventilator support because of COVID-19 infection. And you can see the stats on the left that as of yesterday, almost 63,000 people hospitalized, about a fifth of them in the intensive care unit, and 4,200 people on mechanical ventilators. And if you've ever worked in a hospital or you've visited family members on a ventilator, you know what that's about. Another way that you can look at it, I live outside Chicago and I've been working for the past year with the state on its COVID response. And what you're seeing here on the left is hospital beds, on the right, ICU beds. The total at the top is the total number of beds that are available. Orange beds are empty beds. Blue beds are occupied by people who have something besides COVID, the light blue. And then the dark blue are the number of beds that are being taken care of or being filled by people who have COVID-19 infection. And I will tell you that, just a few weeks ago in Illinois, right around the Christmas holidays, 1 in 6 people in a hospital bed in Illinois was in the bed because of COVID-19. That is unheard of. You never have one condition accounting for 1/6 of your hospital bed days, but that's in fact been the case. And I'm going to wrap up my comments with a little bit of good news and then a little bit of bad news as we segue to Dr. Crook. Early on in the pandemic in Illinois, I surveyed a handful of large hospitals in Illinois that have mature electronic information systems. And this was kind of the picture of what happened to people who got admitted to the hospital. Remember, most people don't get sick enough to get admitted to the hospital. But if you were admitted to the hospital, about half of them went home independently. About 30% of them went home needing assistance, or they had to go to a rehabilitation facility. And about 15% of the people who were admitted to the hospital died. And there's some other data, and I'm happy to share these slides for time. I'm not going to dwell on these data, but give you a sense of the hospital trajectory for people. But the good news is that because of robust clinical trials in the United States, we have seen a marked improvement in outcomes for people who are sick enough to be in the hospital. On the left, this is a study out of a multi-hospital system in New York State. And what you see in these two blue curves from March of last year through August of last year, a marked reduction in the mortality rate for people who were admitted to the hospital from up in the 25% at the beginning of the pandemic down to about 10% in August. And this is because of supportive therapy, better ways of taking care of people so they don't have to be on a ventilator, therapies like corticosteroids. And you see a similar result over here on the right, unpublished data from a colleague of mine at Northwestern showing a reduction in mortality over time between March of last year and October of last year. But the real bad news, and my pivot and handoff to Dr. Crook, who's going to talk about disparities, is data that was shared with us recently by Dr. Allison Arwady, who's the Commissioner of Health for Chicago. And she showed data on cases per 100,000, showing marked disparities. Look at the difference between how many cases were diagnosed in whites in Chicago, indexed for their population, compared to Black and Latino populations, which were just hammered. And similarly, if you look at deaths per 100,000 in Chicago, 80 deaths per 100,000 white Chicagoans, double that for Latinx populations and double that for Black populations. So that is part of the disparity picture that we're seeing, and that's something that Dr. Crook's going to go into greater detail about. So I'll stop my comments there, Julie, and hand it back to you.
Thank you so much. Even more informative, great information to have. And so I appreciate you sharing that with us. So now we're going to move to Dr. Crook. I will go quickly through his biography so that you can get the meat of the content that he has for us today. But he is the Abraham A. Mitchell Chairman and Professor of Internal Medicine and Director of the Center for Healthy Communities at the University of South Alabama College of Medicine. He has background for attending Yale College for his doctorate, for his undergraduate degree, and he received his doctorate from Columbia University. So with that, I'm going to kind of be brief in his bio, but I'm going to let you take over, Dr. Crook, so that you can get to the meat of the presentation.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to present tonight and be a part of this panel. You guys can see my presentation. Okay, wonderful. So let's move through here. My goal tonight is to talk a bit about follow up with Dr. Shannon, from Dr. Shannon, to understand why we're seeing this increase in severe infections and death in ethnic minorities and people who are poor in the United States, and particularly actually in our own state, which suffers significant inequities in health. So jumping into that, the headlines have been out there, and really from the very beginning, there were headlines out there that recognizing and alerting the nation to these disparities in outcomes among patients who had COVID infection, particularly among Black and brown people and people from structurally marginalized communities. And when we think about health disparities and Healthy People 2020, they really expanded out on that definition. It is here to read, but the real emphasis is that there are differences in outcomes from a certain condition or disease because of issues of disadvantage. And that disadvantage can come around several areas of context, like ethnicity, geography, socioeconomic status, gender, etc. And they may manifest themselves in several ways. And what COVID has done is really pulled back the curtain and shone a bright light on health disparities in this nation. And so you can have an earlier onset of a disease, a later time of diagnosis, unequal or lower quality care, have higher death rates, die earlier from it, and loss of quality years of life. And COVID, quite frankly, and maybe except for the early onset of disease in this situation, has all these factors at play with regards to our underserved population. So we know that when we look at the biologic risk factors for having a severe COVID-19 infection, men do worse than women. That's actually not uncommon for most things, diseases. But obesity clearly was shown to be a major factor, one of those quote unquote comorbidities that one can have. And if you had that in the presence of high blood pressure that was poorly controlled and diabetes that was poorly controlled, you were clearly at higher risk. And clearly those folks who are at older age at higher risk. And when you think about obesity, we are a nation that is quite obese. We are a region of the country in the Southeast that's quite obese. As you can see, there's more colors that are a little darker in the Southeastern US. And when you look at it for African Americans, you can see just how intense it is, that with very high prevalences of obesity. This is data that's 5 years old, and I can tell you it stays the same or gets worse. Similar types of patterns could be seen in the nation and for African Americans in type 2 diabetes. And the same thing would be true if I showed you data for hypertension. And when those things come together like that, they end up having consequences in things like stroke and heart disease and kidney disease. And this part of the country and metropolitan areas that are really high populations of African Americans in particular, but also members of Latinx population, have those clusters happen and those comorbidities happen and have those outcomes. And those things are the things that put those populations at much higher risk for having severe infections and even death from COVID-19. We look at Alabama specifically, Our rates of hypertension and diabetes shown here, the same would be true for obesity, are higher than the nation. African Americans have higher rates compared to non-Hispanic whites in Alabama. Those who are poor and those with less educational attainment clearly have higher rates of hypertension, diabetes, and obesity compared to those who are have higher incomes and higher educational attainment. And so when we look at the percentage of in cases by ethnicity in Alabama, you'll see them here. This is data that's gathered by the Kaiser Family Foundation as of the end of January of this year. And you'll notice that specifically, if we take a look at the percent of cases in African Americans, it was 29%, while they make up only 27% of the population. But because early on we were not collecting data on ethnicity, and still in some cases for testing we don't collect this data, there's probably a lot that are being missed there, and that really can be an underestimate. For death, 31% of the deaths in Alabama have been in African Americans, but we only make up 27% of the population. Lots missing with regards to data still regarding ethnicity on people who died. Very early on in the pandemic, we had communities like in Albany, Georgia, some even in the Black Belt of this state, where they had entire families having multiple deaths in African American communities after funerals and things of that nature, not knowing what the disease was and how to prevent it at that time. So it's clearly overrepresentation of African Americans in Alabama with regards to cases and deaths. And as Ms. Goolsby mentioned at the beginning, there's a real impact of this now, and to the point that we as a country have a shorter life expectancy, and this is both from at birth and probably even more to the point for people who are age 65 and up. I can tell you that this data that was put out on NPR and the PBS NewsHour, but came from the National Vital Statistics set, is thought to be perhaps an underestimate based on some other studies that have been done by other demographers. The upshot here, though, is while we lost almost a year of life expectancy due to this infection as a nation, which is horrible, you can see that particularly for African American men and women, Black men have almost lost 3 years, and the same is true for Hispanics. Interesting thing about long life expectancy in this nation is that there's something called the Hispanic paradox, where Hispanics actually have a longer life expectancy in the US than non-Hispanic whites. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that. And many of them are more cultural and supportive and family oriented than they are related to biology. But the gaps where between Black and white life expectancy have gotten bigger after taking decades to try to narrow them some. And now the gaps between Hispanic and non-Hispanic whites, which had been in favor of Hispanics, have really come very close to being equal again, which a lot of lost ground there. So one of the ways we need to think through this is, why are these poor outcomes? Is this an issue of biology or an issue of sociology? And we think about those social determinants of health, all those things that an individual has in their life, over their lifetime, where they lived, how they lived, the environment they were in, before they even get to the healthcare system, those so-called upstream factors. And you see a list of them here, those in bold, the ones that have had a significant impact on how COVID impacts communities around the world, but specifically as we talk today in the US and in Alabama. And it's those social cultural risk factors that are really strongly associated with severe infection and death. such as the crowded housing, multi-generational housing, which in many cases is a strength because of things like having multiple child care options and support within the family. But when there are too many generations in the family, the older ones particularly become at risk. Being low wage earners, those are the people who were deemed to be essential workers and could not work from home, or they lost their employment and fell into poverty and had lack of resources. There has been a lack of access to resources for many of these individuals. And then we have that issue of mistrust, both in the healthcare system, the government, and other agencies. We at the Center for Health Communities we've just actually released a report that we pulled together from a qualitative study on individuals early on in the pandemic. And one of the things, many things they talked about is about the need for consistent, unified, and straightforward messaging about this, and to be truthful and to build that trust. In Alabama, with our history of things such as the Tuskegee syphilis study, and the father of gynecology did his work in Montgomery on operating on women, Black women without anesthesia. Those things build up. The story of Henrietta Lacks, those things build up, as well as just other things that run rampant through the community. Those are the things that led to lack of testing, lack of seeking out care early, that led to enhanced death. And now the part of the battles that we're fighting with regards to making sure we have everybody take advantage of the vaccine. So as we wind up, we have these questions about is it biology or sociology? Is it race, ethnicity, or is it racism? Is it genetics, or is it socioeconomic inequities? And I think in large part here, what we're talking about, even with the increased amount of prevalence of these comorbidities, which you could say is biology, that is actually still rooted in social cultural factors, those social terms of health, not having access to safe, lower stress communities that are not food deserts, that have opportunities to have physical activity and to live the lives that we lead. It is interesting to note that there is data from actually a couple of studies that show that once an individual gets into the healthcare system with COVID-19, their outcomes appear to be equal with regards to ethnicity. So it's actually getting to the healthcare system is the big part, and getting there at a time when we have opportunities to actually save them. And as I end up here, so we're ultimately talking about health equity. And health equity is about making sure we create an environment that is fair for all, so that everyone has the opportunity to have the best chance at life, and in this case, best chance at health. And so the top panel, we have this demonstration of equality. Everyone has a bicycle. They have the same bicycle, but it's not the right bike for everyone. Whereas on the bottom panel, we take into account the specific characteristics of each individual, and we customize their mode of transportation to them so that everyone has an equal and fair chance to propel themselves forward. And what we need to do, and what we're looking to do with things like COVID, is to create that equity and that strong messaging, getting that information out to people, taking the vaccine out into the areas where people may not have trust or won't leave, have barriers to transportation, are going to be important in creating that equitable environment, and series like this are also very important in that. So with that, I appreciate your time and look forward for opportunities for some discussion.
Thank you very much. That was really, really insightful. And, as you're going through it, I couldn't help but think that, like many things, this is just a big onion that has so many layers. Once you think you've got one layer figured out, you pull it back, and now you've got to address the other one. And so that's kind of the way that I look at it. So what we're going to do now, because I've got a bunch of questions, is open the floor for questions. Excuse me. So if you have one, if you could do me a favor and use the raise your hand option located at the bottom of the screen. It should have a raise your hand option. If not, then I don't see the raise your hand option. I'm thinking of maybe Teams So I apologize, wrong system. Just go ahead and jump in and ask questions, and we'll try to take them as they come.
And Julie, it's under the reactions. You can raise your hand under the reactions.
Perfect. Thank you. So if we could do that, and then I'll be able to see you. You raising your hand, and I can call you out to ask a question. Okay, so far no hands are raised. So I'm going to start the question segment, and then maybe by then you can figure it out, or maybe it sparks some more conversation. So one of the things I was thinking about as Dr. Fox was going through the building of the virus is how it attacks cells. Is there any information or any data that suggests that people with sickle cell anemia are more susceptible to catching coronavirus or have a higher risk of morbidity because of the way that their cells respond?
Julie, I haven't seen anything on that. The only thing I've seen that relates to who might be more susceptible, and it's right now just a theory, but maybe some people genetically have more ACE2 receptors on their cells than other people, which would make them more susceptible to the virus. But that's the only thing I can think of that I've seen that relates to what you're asking.
And I'll comment, part of my talk, we had put in there is this genetics, biology versus sociology and social cultural issues. In African Americans, said we have higher rates of hypertension. It's been decades long searches for understanding that, and there have been lots of genetic studies. So there, in many cases, higher levels of H2 in that population. But as of yet, as Dr. Fox said, that has not been shown to be a reason for more severe infections, more frequent infections, or death.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jack.
Jack, we can't hear you.
You're still on mute, Jack. There you go. Hold on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, what a Luddite. All right, Dr. Fox, I apologize for my geezer status here, but watching the transmission of these viruses, and I remember probably the oldest guy in this panel is a kid in the 50s with polio, which is a virus, and we have with that with different vaccines, et cetera, in the progression. And although I was a chemistry minor at Spring Hill, I can't say my biology grades were very good, unlike my patriot at Jay Shannon. But I'm just curious, when you look forward, and as we hear about, you mentioned about the environmental conditions, we look at as I think as Dr. Crook mentioned about conditions about living and et cetera. Do you anticipate that going forward we're going to have an acceleration of mutations and these kind of unforeseen viruses that maybe are unique and follow a path? I don't know if we're going to have COVID-21 in 1922 and 2022, or do you have any? Is there any projections going on about worrying about how we're going to adapt to this going forward?
Well, Jack, unfortunately, yes. And not just going forward from this point in time. They've been predicting this pretty much my whole career in microbiology. I've been hearing about, we're waiting for the next big pandemic. And, we've created in our world as humans a scenario where it's out of control now. And it's, there's just so much destruction of the ecology, so much destruction of the animal habitat, and changes in the way animals are living and the way we're interacting with animals. And add to that global travel when there's not a pandemic, and how quickly people can get from one area to another. I mean, it's all contributing to these pathogens emerging. In fact, I teach a course every summer, Emerging Pathogens, and that whole term and area of medicine came about in the 1990s. I mean, they've been talking about emerging pathogens and studying them for decades now. And unfortunately, we've already seen now 3 cases where coronaviruses have jumped from animal to human. I can't predict the future, but I bet you it's going to happen again.
Well, let me ask the panel, do you expect that going forward, that again, anecdotally, that I noticed that I see my Asian counterparts having been in China, that do you think that, and I noticed, I looked on Jay's craft about Indonesians, et cetera, and I know South Koreans have a much lower incidence, it appears, of communicating or transmitting the disease. Do you expect that part of the day rigor will be that we'll be wearing masks now for a generation?
I hope not. I personally, I don't think so. I'm leaning more toward the optimistic side. Our immune response is not, remember that protein on the viral structure that said looked like a fried chicken leg?
Yes.
Well, all those little points on it, our immune response is attacking at multiple points on there. So even if there's a mutation in one, it would be like, okay, now the Navy SEALs can't attack the enemy like they could before, but everyone else still can. So even though we may hamper part of the immune response, unless an escape mutant is generated, I think we're going to be able to get a handle on this. And it's a race right now. If we can slow down the production of these variants by vaccinating and doing all the mitigation factors and wearing our mask, I think, in 6 months, we may see we're not wearing masks anymore.
Okay, well, I'm a former Marine. I'm hoping we have a few good antibodies out there. Thank you.
Okay.
But I think that the other point I would say in follow-up to Dr. Fox's comments, which I support, is that I do think it's likely that this has got a strong foothold, and it's quite likely that we'll be looking at annual vaccination and possibly even later this year needing to get different vaccination if some of these variants get a handle. So the suspicion now is that this may turn out to be like seasonal influenza and that you need to get a vaccine each year. The other point that I guess I would make is that where we've seen lower transmission has been oftentimes in countries where masking as part of the public face for people is much more normalized, and there's not as much shaking of hands. And so whether it's those things or whether it's other hygienic attributes in those populations that have decreased the transmission, particularly throughout parts of Asia where it's been the norm for years for people to wear masks when they're out in public, or particularly when they're in crowded public spaces or public transportation. And I think, we'll all have to make our own choices, but I think we're going to be seeing people wearing masks on trains and airplanes and buses and the L for years and years to come. And that'll probably serve us well. One of the things that we've seen, Jack, and I'll stop my comments here, marked reduction in the number of cases of influenza this year. And it's felt that that's because of the social distancing and wearing masks and attention to hand hygiene and so on.
I also will add to that question, it's not the virus's goal to kill everyone. Okay, the virus won't have anyone to replicate in if it kills everyone. So as time goes on, the mutant or the variant that becomes predominant is the one that can transmit the easiest to humans and the one that causes less severe disease. Now, how long that takes, I don't know. I mean, that could be 5 years, 10 years down the road, but as it evolves and adapts, it's going to push it toward the variant that is most easily transmitted to humans, but also causes less severe disease.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. Charles?
First, I want to just thank all the participants tonight. It's really intriguing talk, and being a physician myself, as all the physicians on this panel, we've been living in a COVID world for a year now, and I can't say a day doesn't go by and I read as much as I can, even though I'm an ophthalmologist, not an infectious disease doctor. But as many of y'all may know, the first physician that died of COVID was an ophthalmologist in China, and now he's a martyr. One statement is that I work in an eye and ear, nose, and throat practice, and to Jay Shannon's note about the decreased amount of influenza, my poor ENT colleagues are begging for work. I mean, they're like, they're amazingly slow right now compared to they normally are this time of the year. So it has dramatically affected their practice, and that's in Mobile, Alabama, which is allergy capital of the world, as we like to call it. Plus, we haven't been the greatest as far as wearing masks. Everything that you read about here is true. I mean, I've been vaccinated, but everywhere I go in my own very educated circle, people do not wear masks, unfortunately. But the question that I had was for anyone on this panel, physician, or even if anyone else has had the vaccine. I've had both doses. I'm curious if anyone has quantified their antibodies, and if they have, what has been their result?
I haven't. I will say this. I'm actually a COVID survivor. I had my vaccine about 50 days out from infection, and I feel pretty comfortable. I had antibody because the next day I had COVID again. Basically, I had all those symptoms: fevers, chills, body aches, but it was gone in 24 hours, and symptoms were taken care of with Tylenol. So at least that far out, I'm pretty clear I had it because I had a quick response. But I don't know of anyone who's checked antibodies after that, except from a clinical trial. And what I know from clinical trials is that there are people who have been checked, I think now as far as 6 months out, a very few who had antibody detected and neutralizing antibody detected at that point, I think. But I think Moderator did it, and they got out to about 3 months for most people at that end point.
Errol, I'll echo.
Sorry, Jennifer, go ahead.
Oh, just to echo, I have not quantified my antibodies either, but I also had my vaccine 30 days out from a COVID infection, and agree there clearly were antibodies present because I felt like I had it all over again. My understanding from the Pfizer trial was neutralizing antibodies 3 to 10 times that of natural infection after the second dose, but I have not quantified.
That's a very interesting question.
I don't know if y'all can hear it. I was just curious, one, that the things that we read about the two physicians that have spoken up that had the vaccine and had COVID, that's what you read about. There was an article I recently read in the New York Times, and one of them wasn't actually an ophthalmologist that had COVID, had the vaccine, and she was afraid that she had COVID again after her first dose, and said that she wasn't sure if she was getting the second dose. So there have been some talk about, I ask our infectious disease doctor, but about maybe people that have had COVID, if they can get by with just having one dose and not having the second dose, because everyone that I know that has had COVID, initially as infection, has reacted to the vaccine. I had no reaction at all to first or second dose. And I have quantified my antibodies. I have 2 partners that were in the trial. So I had access to quantifying it. And it was a lab out in Salt Lake City that did it. And it was just a good feeling to be very sure that I actually do have antibodies. I was just curious if anyone else was doing that.
I think the real question we still have to answer, and so we all kind of in a living experiment, is how long those antibodies last after immunization or after infection for that matter. And unfortunately, it's like every time we start moving forward, we don't take 2 steps back. We sometimes get, I think it's a half step, because we're clearly, Dr. Shannon's got to show that we're improving. But we're now, while it's still rare, we're now starting to see more cases of reinfection. We're a year out. So those people who had infection, 6 months ago or more are having it. You're having more cases of that. So that, I hope that trend is not one that continues, and we'll have to look at that pretty intently as we follow up from what happens to people post-vaccination.
We've got a question for Maura. You had your hand up, Maura.
I did. Sorry, I'm letting dogs in and out. Hold on one sec. Okay, yes, sorry. This is sort of a sociological, cultural question, I think, although maybe for Dr. Crook and Dr. Shannon. Do you know of any initiatives for overcoming vaccine hesitancy in some of the populations that are exhibiting it?
There are many. I've been a part of several that we're doing through USA Health. I can say that the Alabama Department of Public Health has put out a call for proposals that we in the Center for Health Communities and others at USA Health are responding to, and other entities across the state are responding to do just that, to kind of get lots of minds around that. It's going to be, I think, a multi-pronged effort, and it's both in communication, addressing directly concerns that individuals have, and then getting by those barriers of geography for those rural populations and transportation and those things. And there's going to have to probably be some pop-up clinics that'll show up in places where people just don't have the opportunities to get to a large distribution site of interest. And I'll let Dr. Shannon speak. NPR had a story about this, and they were discussing, it had the main character in the story is a woman who was in her late 70s from Baton Rouge and lived 15 miles outside. And they mentioned in that story that many of the cities, they said specifically southern cities, who had distribution sites. Those distribution sites were very close to or right next to a major health center. And they specifically mentioned Mobile and when they named off 6 cities. And so we recognize that, and as time goes on, because you can't immunize 250 million people in a short period of time. It's going to take months. It's getting that, what I'm thinking, we're talking about getting that last 25 to 50 million by using the methods I chatted about.
Yeah, I just sharing this slide to show differences. And again, I'm happy to have Julie distribute my slides to everybody here. But this is a survey that was done by the city of Chicago, broken down by ethnicity. What's the likelihood when the vaccine's available that you'll take it? You can see that the overall average was about 46% of people said they'd be very likely to take it. But when you looked at different populations, much higher rates of white people saying that they would take it. And then when you get into people who were resistant to it, those were overrepresented in Black and brown communities. And I think to your question, there's a lot of sociologic study that's been done around this. You've heard people talking about using trusted messengers, so-called trusted messengers, whether those are people from the community, people from the faith community. What's been shown to not be useful is to lead about the safety of the vaccine. So I think people don't want to have their disbelief directly confronted. But I think talking about the personal relationship, so aside from trusted messengers being people that are known or that look like the person who's getting the message, another group of trusted messengers is people who have taken the vaccine or people who have been ill with COVID and have taken the vaccine, and focusing on the fact that the vaccine has been shown to reduce the likelihood that you will get sick and die. Making it personal about the vaccine's effectiveness, not about its safety, but about its effectiveness of keeping you from getting sick and in the hospital or dying, seems to be some of the themes. But there's a whole package of stuff that the CDC and others are putting out. But there's no question that that package has to be taken and then thematically customized, I think, by people who understand the community and the patients that they care for to overcome those hurdles.
So Jay, I'm going to ask a question that kind of stems from that. And one of the things that we understand is that in the Black community, there's many years, generations of mistrust of the healthcare system. And some people may say, well, yeah, Tuskegee syphilis experiment was a long time ago. Things have changed since then. It's better get back into the healthcare system. But then I read articles that not even 5 years ago, a study of medical students revealed that many of the medical students had a belief that African Americans had a higher threshold for pain than the white counterparts. So how do you undermine, or how do we get people into medical care sooner? Because once you're in care, the likelihood decreases. So how do we get people into the system sooner and cultivate those relationships from when a child is born, trusting a physician through their entire life and having a different experience? And then also, how do we address the bias nature or the biases that are problematic inside of the healthcare professional world? So I guess it's two questions.
Well, each of them, in my mind, Julie, is you know, a very, very long discussion. You know, those kinds of things are really critically important. There's no question that there's bias in healthcare professionals, just like there is in the whole general population. I think many medical schools and many medical centers, the medical center that I ran, had required bias training for all of our staff, but particularly focusing on the direct facing caregiving staff. And, you know, that's a start. So I think the place where you start with these kinds of things is recognizing and admitting you've got a problem. Dr. Crook did a fabulous job of showing us just the kind of the tip of the iceberg, but every layer that you look at, whether it's treatment for pain, whether it's time to get treatment in the emergency room, whether it's making assumptions about your healthcare decisions, implicit bias is rampant in US healthcare. And I think only by recognizing the problem will we be able to start addressing it.
Any commentary on how do we get people in the medical into a good position earlier in their life so that they are in the system and trust the system by the time pandemics happen for the future?
I'd make two general comments, and then I'd be interested to hear what how Dr. Crook would add to that. One would be that we've got to get to the point where access to healthcare is understood as a right and it's not a privilege. So I think getting universal access, you know, if people are inhibited because I can't go to the doctor because it's either that or groceries, or it's that or the rent, or it's that or, you know, food, you know, utilities, whatever. So universal access is a start. I think a second part is diversifying our healthcare workforce. And, you know, if you look across the country, I think the current statistic is something like 3.5 or 4% of US physicians are African-American. Nowhere near the population, and the studies that have been done would suggest at least two important outcomes happen when you've got a more diverse workforce. One is that they're oftentimes more trusted, whether we like it or not. We have more trust in people who look, seem, and sound like we are. And the second thing is that most of the studies that have been done on physicians of color have shown that it's much more likely that they're going to work with vulnerable populations. They're going to accept those people into their practice. So those would be two concrete examples of things that I think we can do to improve the circumstances today in the country.
And I fully support those comments. The numbers even are worse still when you look at African-American men who are graduating from medical school. In fact, those numbers are significantly worse than they were in the early 70s. And there's a significant effort ongoing now to try to correct that. You know, those things will take time, however, and there's been recognition that it will be quite a while before you have a physician, or I'm going to just use a much broader term, a healthcare provider workforce that is going to mirror by percentage the general population. That's going to take some time, because the similar numbers are seen for dentists, pharmacists, physical therapists, occupational therapists. They aren't as bad for nursing, but the disparities are there. And so those are going to take time. So a large part of what we recognize is, getting back to what one of the things Dr. Shannon mentioned, is that we all are going to have to care for people who are going to be a very diverse population and not look like us or grew up like us, et cetera. And so having the conversation, and conversations like these are immensely important. I'm happy we're living in a time where we can talk about this openly now and share with each other. And I think it's important that a provider, or when they're with a patient, feel comfortable asking questions that allow them to build that relationship with the patient. And there are ways to do that, training programs to do that. But I think one of the most important ways to train the individuals to do that is through role modeling. And having the folks who teach, like myself and Dr. Scalise and others, Shannon, role model that for younger providers in training, and to actually bring these topics up on rounds in the right way, to have those discussions so that we produce a workforce that's going to be, the term I use is sort of culturally sensitive, because it's almost impossible to be fully competent. I mean, just way too averse to know all of that, but to be sensitive and open, and to feel comfortable asking those questions and building those relationships. With regards to getting people into the healthcare system, turns out for African Americans and for Hispanic and the Latinx population, it doesn't seem to work so well by trying to convince a man to go to the doctor. But if you can convince the woman in the life, right, the mom, the sister, the grandmother, the wife, the daughters, they're the ones, by pestering, can make that happen. And we've learned that through a lot of work we've done, and it really has to be peer pressure and family pressure. So whatever we can do to make that happen and take advantage of those opportunities.
Well, I'm sorry laughing, but you're absolutely 100% correct. You got to get the mom to go, because just growing up, I would always say, well, he's a man, he's not going to go to the doctor. I would hear that all the time. And so one of the things that I would kind of add to that, though, is when we look at particularly the Black female mother in a family, a lot of times they are the last to take care of themselves. Everyone else becomes a priority. So she may not have the time to go see the doctor to make that a regular habit.
Right.
Truly, how do we address that and reemphasize that self-care is the best care? As my mom would say, if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of anybody else. But she didn't always practice that either. How do we work against that?
Well, I think, what Dr. Shannon has said about healthcare being a right and not a privilege, and having access, removing that barrier, at least a financial barrier, I think will go a long way. If you get that, then you can get people in, and you can have conversations with them and start a long-term relationship. But that is in large part one of the biggest barriers. And it's not just having access, though, but you also need to have policies in the workplace that's going to also support that. So And we as providers are going to have to be mindful of that and cognizant of that and understand that people can't take the whole day off to come and see us, because those are lost wages. Even if they can come at costs that they can afford, it's still lost wages. And at the end of the day, for many members of our U.S. population, healthcare is still discretionary spending. The same is true for education, you know, and particularly for tutoring or extra help. That's discretionary spending. And if we still have to make a choice between that and buying food, food always wins out.
I would add to that, Dr. Crook, it's so true. You know, in what I do, GYN oncology, we see a lot of these women who have been taking care of other family members and addressing other family issues, whether it's health or social, and we meet these patients, you know, at the end stage of something, you know, that has been neglected. And in the field of OBGYN, you know, at the beginning, a lot of the prenatal care, a lot of the access and the interaction with the system is somewhat covered by various means, even for women of lower socioeconomic means. But what we see a lot is once they're past childbearing age, there's a huge gap in the interaction with the healthcare system because they lose their coverage or they lose the ability, you know, to seek out care. So again, lost wages is a big problem, especially in our cervical cancer patients, where they're having to come regularly, and working around that is difficult. But do you see this pandemic and then move to things like virtual visits and changing the platforms for interacting with the healthcare system? Do you see that as something that is going to be a long-term change, that is an avenue to address some of these issues, or are the limitations in that platform still so significant that we need to get back to in-person visits?
Well, I think you know, I do live by that mantra of rising tide lifts all boats. I think the problem is if a boat's stuck in the mud with an anchor, it ends up just being flooded by the water. And so we have that issue of not having the technology. I think all those things that increase access are good. It turns out all those platforms prior to COVID-19 were being when they were being put in place, in large part were being put in place by folks who are entrepreneurial, and it was going to folks who already had access, and they had the technological savvy, they had the health literacy to be able to have an interaction like that. And what I recognized, and I'm sure you did too, is that during our shutdown, and we had to have all these virtual visits, that there was a group of people who you only could have a phone visit with, so you couldn't see them and you couldn't interact with them, and you missed a lot of the visual cues that you would get in having that. But at the end of the day, I still hope it works. It's been shown very well with mental health that that's a great platform to get a very, very valuable, but unfortunately under capacity a resource to even within urban areas sometimes, but particularly out to rural areas. And they seem to be able to develop relationships and be able to make it work. And I'm hoping that the innovation and entrepreneurship for those folks who will come up with the tools that allow us to do it. So I actually think it will help. But again, I believe it's going to need to be a multi-pronged approach ultimately to get where we need to be. And
Any
now
other
I
questions,
just,
Ryan?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, you were just kind of touching on it right there, but it seems like a lot of times in these conversations, we end up talking a lot about the interventions that need to happen in the Black community or the underprivileged communities. And I'm wondering what interventions need to happen in the privileged communities so that we work towards equity instead of the kind of equality that we're kind of always preaching. I mean, obviously, not everything works for everyone. And obviously that's the interventions that keep being put on, communities of color, but the privileged communities could have interventions as well. I'm curious if you guys could expound on that.
Yeah, I'd say a couple things about that, Ryan. From my vantage point, a few things that people don't understand always, that a healthier community is a stronger community economically. So one way that you can approach that is, at the end of the day, if it's nothing but the bottom line that matters to people, what you find is that in communities where access to care is better, that the health and the vibrancy of the community is far better. A second one is to appeal to the fact, and these contagious illnesses are a way to do it. But I had an old mentor in Dallas who used to say, well, people start feeling differently about that if the person who's walking past them on the street has untreated tuberculosis, or if the person who's caring for their child has hepatitis A and can transmit that to them. And so I think building up a shared sense of responsibility for community members and talking with people about the fact, I mean, it is astonishing. And it's not only because of a lack of a uniform access to healthcare, but it is astonishing that the United States is the only developed country of economic means that is seeing a decreasing life expectancy during our generation. That's astonishing. It's not a surprise if you see that from Russia, but from the United States, it's astonishing. And it has to do with not only access to care, but a whole bunch of different sociologic drivers that I would posit, and this is an opinion now, not a fact, I would posit are a lack of a sense of shared value as Americans, of caring for each other, as opposed to we're just all GDIs and good luck, you're on your own, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. That's my opinion.
I agree with that. I think probably the best intervention that I see, and is my opinion and some experience of this, is basically making sure that everyone understands where those inequities exist. I have faith in this nation that there are enough people out there who are want to be able to help those who are less fortunate, and they just need to know where to direct their energies. And if we can develop that interest and entrepreneurship around focusing on those inequities and fixing those, I'm actually comfortable that ultimately they will get fixed. So the population to really focus on, I think, actually, quite frankly, is students like those at Spring Hill College, and these types of issues are making their way into curriculum now. And when you talk to students of this age, and they think about things differently, they come up with fresh ways to do it. The idea of being engaged with the community is not a foreign idea to them. It's something they get behind. Having the community engagement as part of the curriculum is critical and important, and they are able to nurture that quality within themselves. Jay mentioned of wanting to be able to, get better together and to serve each other, support each other, as opposed to being individuals out there for themselves.
Dr. Cook, I would agree exactly what you said. Being a father of two daughters that are in their 20s, this generation that has come up within, our parenthood, me being a parent, they are just so driven by service and by the heart. Jay and I think, are probably the same age. I mean, we grew up kind of in the Reagan years, and it was just different. It was, fight as hard as you can, work as hard as you can, and you will accomplish something, and that it was more individualistic. But now I think we are living more in a community world where the young people, I think, are inspiring. Even my own two daughters have inspired me and made me more community and giving and caring and all the things that Spring Hill College offers. I'm so glad someone's mentioned about our students and kind of our mission and that we are producing students that have that type of heart. So I just feel that there is that heart of service that is really going to change the world and the way we see things and the access for people that don't have access now. Because I think the key, as everyone has mentioned, is access to care and trust of your provider. And if you don't get access to care, or when you have access to care and it's always in a traumatic emergent situation, you're going to be fearful and frightened, and you will not want to go back to a physician if you're frightened. But if you have situations when you're being cared because of preventative measures, that I think you're going to have build and develop a community that will be willing to seek care and care for, and that we have to just care for each other.
Absolutely, 100% correct. I agree with you wholeheartedly, Charles. We are at time, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But if anyone has any burning questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. This session has been recorded, and so if you would like a copy of the recording, please email diat@shc.edu, and we'll be happy to share the recording out. And if we have the permission of Dr. Crook, Dr. Fox, and Dr. Shannon, we can share the presentation material as well. So send an email to diat@shc.edu, and we can get that material to you. So I don't see any hands up, but I've got one burning question. Sorry, guys, I have to ask. So mental health has always been kind of taboo in the Black community. It's just something that you're told as a very young child, we don't have mental health problems, we don't go see shrinks, that's not what we do. But we're also seeing that African-American children are less likely to have access to Wi-Fi or internet service to be able to attend virtual classes. They're more likely to be impacted by a household who someone in their family dies from COVID-19. And so I'm expecting that the mental health is going to be the next wave of issue that comes behind COVID that's going to last for generation after generation after generation. How do we preemptively build up a faucet to kind of be able to treat those people? It's coming.
Yeah, I guess I'll start off and let others chime in. So for school-age kids in particular, with those issues, it's actually oftentimes the school system where a teacher, a counselor, a coach may make that observation and be able to bring it to the parents' attention or hopefully make that connection. I'm hoping that we can get a nation vaccinated and the vaccines are effective, and that by next school year, we can be comfortable that we can have children back in school and safely. Emphasis on safely. But you're also the other places where we would gather are not places we often gather anymore, whether it's church or many other places, sporting events, we don't gather. So it's that isolation, and so it's really universal. There are lots of people, regardless of ethnicity, that are hesitant about seeking mental health. And I think a large part of what we're going to need to think about for mental health is not think just about the physician and the psychologist, but think at levels of those therapists and counselors who actually are more, and they have more access. They're embedded in the community, and we're going to have to do everything we can to sort of prop them up and to have their services available. In large part, it's going to be about just having someone to talk to get through the stress and anxiety of this time, and everyone's feeling it. School-age kids are actually feeling it more than other parts of the population right now.
Yeah, I think that's well said. My wife is a nurse on the faculty at University of Illinois College of Nursing, and her focus is on community health by way of school nursing. And I think Dr. Crook's point about the school being the place we've known, it's a great place for people like me who are interested in asthma. It's a great place to get asthma addressed. It's a great place to get other things addressed. And mental health is one of them. And I think the other observation I'd echo from Dr. Crook is that we're not going to be able to psychiatrist our way out of this. There are never going to be enough psychiatrists, but broadening the diverse workforce that's able to be the open door is one part. Destigmatizing is another part. Patrick Kennedy, the former congressman from Rhode Island, has started a thing called the Kennedy Forum, and he pushed for the Mental Health Parity Act in the United States, suggesting that insurance companies have to pay for mental health services the same way that they do for physical health services. So I think getting coverage for those kinds of things is important, but an important push of the Kennedy Forum is simply to destigmatize it. It's not, about the crazy aunt in the attic, and it's not about, all you have to do is to look at public health data for the country and see the fact that suicide is the leading cause of death, not the leading cause of death, is one of the top 5 or 6 leading cause of death through age groups up well into middle age, into the 40s and 50s. And it's rising, particularly among youth. And if you look in the United States, twice as many people die of gunshots, self-inflicted, as by homicides with a gun. So the point about mental health being stigmatized and having to address it, I think, is a good one, Julie.
Thank you all so much. We're going to wrap it up. I really appreciate everyone being able to make it tonight, and thank you to our experts for just this very super informative panel, because I've learned quite a bit, and hopefully everyone else has too, and we'll be sharing out this material. But thank you so much. We appreciate everyone who was able to make it, and you all have a wonderful evening, and we will see you around. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.